Hi, my name is Chasity Starns, and I'm here to present my action research project to you. And I chose to do text feature instruction to help improve student comprehension in informational text. And what my action research is about is I had some data that I collected from my fall 2015 MAP assessment, and I saw that many students were not proficient in the area of informational text and that they were struggling with comprehension and text features. And so I decided to implement text feature instruction into my small group during my RTI time so I could help students with comprehension and fluency. And I also wanted to explore and determine the impact that text feature instruction might actually have on my informational text for my students. And I implemented this in my classroom during the fall 2015 to spring 2015 school year. And at the end, I concluded if my intervention was successful or not. The purpose of my study was to help increase students' informational text comprehension through the use of text features. And I want my students to become more successful readers and be able to decode and understand the informational text that they are reading. And I wanted to create strategies that help students have higher comprehension levels and use all of the text features correctly, and as well as be more fluent readers when they have informational text in front of them. And I want to determine if my impact of text feature instruction was actually helping students improve their comprehension of informational text. And some of the research findings that I found, and I had 3 subcategories that I went into, and I chose a topic of the importance of informational text. I feel like informational text is extremely important to second grade students because it is everywhere, that they're in their newspapers, in their technology articles, and it's a resource for students to explore and engage their curiosity, as well as help them answer questions about topics that they may be interested in, such as an informational dinosaur book or a book about different types of sharks. And I also chose incorporating text feature teaching strategies. I thought this was important since I want to incorporate them into students' understanding of informational text. I like the big book strategy. Is you pull them down during during whole group, and you introduce a new text feature to them all together before you even start teaching it. That way, students are prepared about what they're going to be learning with text features for that week. And I also found that illustrations and photographs, whenever you can show them about a text feature, is very important because it can help the students get a visual of what the text feature actually looks like. If it is a bold word and bold print that you're teaching students about, then if they can actually see several different pictures of bolded word, it's going to help them remember what that bold word looks like and what they're looking for when they see that text feature. And when you draw attention to your pictures and your written text, it gives a student a chance to see it twice, so it allows them to keep that in their mind longer. And then I chose text feature teaching interventions, and these are interventions that I used during my small group in my RTI, and I use these daily. I gave students a chance to analyze informational textbooks when I pulled out small level readers that were related to informational text. I gave my students a chance to go through them and look through them before we actually began reading the book, to give them a chance to discuss maybe what they thought they were going to end up reading before we actually began. And I did the writing paragraphs using text features. After every new text feature that my students learn, we would write a small paragraph about it, and I would also let them do that in a small group. I would let them discuss that with one another and with their partner and by themselves. That gave them several different opportunities to get to use that text feature. And I thought that that was a very effective intervention because my students were able to actually be more involved with their learning of the text features. And I did the cover and image of a text feature being read aloud, where you just take a Post-it note and put it over your picture or your illustration, and then you ask the students to read the words under it and ask them what that might help them learn from that informational text. And then when you pull the Post-it off, they see the picture, and you can ask them, well, what else might this help you learn when discussing informational text? And here's my references of everything that I've concluded from my research. And my research question was, what effect does explicitly taught text features have on second grade comprehension of informational text? My justification of the research method was, I found that 67% of my second grade classroom were below grade level in informational text at the beginning of the fall 2015 school year. I also decided to take this data and give a correlating pre-assessment that I created over text features, and that showed me that 96% of my students were below grade level at their ability to understand text features in informational text during the beginning of the fall 2015 school year. And my plan was to work on incorporating text feature instruction during my interventions to help my students improve their ability to comprehend informational text. My sampling and participants, I had 24 second grade students in my homeroom ages 7 to 9. I had 13 girls and I had 12 boys. I had 2 students with an IEP in speech. I had 4 students with an IEP in reading, 2 students with an IEP for movement and occupational therapy, 1 English language learner, and 6 RTI students, and I had 8 students scoring at grade level or higher on their MAPS assessment in informational text. My instruments and materials that I used to help guide my research question was the MAPS assessment, and I used that to measure student progress from the fall 2015, winter 2015-16, and spring 2016. I also used a teacher-created assessment that I used to see if students understood text features, and I also used that in the fall, winter, and spring. And then I did weekly comprehension checks from our Treasures reading series. I took leveled readers and when I pulled students back during small group discussion, and I would assess their ability to understand and identify text features that we were talking about during the week. And I also used a text feature weekly assessment, and this was just a small assessment that I gave to all students to see if they were actually comprehending the text features that I had been teaching for that week. My MAPS assessment instrument, here are some sample questions of what the MAP reading actually looks like to the students when they take the MAPS assessment. It gave me baseline data of where my students were at, and it helps me be able to provide specialized instruction on where I need to go with my students. And the information from MAPS is that when students are scoring in the 10th percentile or below, they are considered my Tier 3 students, and they're in my RTI groups at the intensive level. My students who are scoring in the 11th to 25th percentile are considered my Tier 2 students, and they are at the strategic level of my RTI groupings. And then I have my students who are scoring from the 25th to the 100th percentile, and they're considered my Tier 1 students, and they're considered my RTI groupings at the enrichment level. Here is the teacher-created assessment that I made, and it was focused on text features related to informational text, and it had 25 questions on it, and they were multiple choice, short answer, and fill in the blank. And I gave this assessment in the fall, winter, and spring. Here is a picture of some of the treasures level readers that I let my students read throughout the year. And we did our weekly comprehension checks with these because there are specific text features in every leveled reader available to the students, and I would give them a new one every week when we were focusing on a new text feature. Here's an example of some of the text feature assessments that I used, and we completed these weekly based on whatever text feature was being taught during that week. And these various assessments also contained fill in the blank, multiple choice, and short answer. And the data collection that I used to help me with my research question was my MAP assessment data, my teacher-created assessment, my weekly comprehension checks, and my text features assessments. And using all of this data allowed me to see where my students were learning at and their actual comprehension of text features in informational text. The data analysis of my MAP assessment baseline helped me figure out where this research question actually needed to start. In my graph here, in the graph that I've got here, I've got my percentages shown for all 24 of my students in their informational text assessment during the fall 2015 MAP assessment. You can see that 16 students scored below the second grade level in the low and low average on their MAP assessment, and that was equivalent to 67% of my classroom. And some reasons why these students are not at grade level is because some of these students are my RTI students and my IEP students, and they're also just struggling in general with their ability to comprehend text when they're reading it. I also continued on with my data analysis of my MAPs, and I wanted to show a fall-spring MAP comparison of the MAP percentiles that my students fell under. And like I said, if my students were scoring in the 10th percentile or below, they were served as my Tier 3 students. If my students fell into the 11th to 25th percentile, they were served as my Tier 2 students. And my data and results of this are being carried on throughout the next slide. But some reasons why some of my students didn't increase in the levels, if you'll look, like with the 51st percentile and the 75th percentile, it stayed the same. And these numbers only changed slightly by one student, which is about 4%. And some reasons why they didn't increase was our MAPS test gets harder throughout the year, and the MAP assessment is not read to the students in second grade like it is in first grade. So they kind of struggle with that at the beginning of every year in second grade because they have to actually read it themselves. It's not read to them. And if you'll look over here at my fall-spring MAP comparison again with my percentiles, the number above the bars actually represents the number of students in that area. And the dark blue is my fall area and the light blue is my spring area. And some of the percentages that I found of my students that fell into the 10th percentile or below that were served as my tier 3 students in the fall, that was 21% of my students, and it fell to 17% of my students in the spring semester. And with my 11th to 25th percentile, my tier 2 students, I had 13% in the fall and it increased to 17% in the spring. And a combination of both of my tier 2 and tier 3 students, it actually averaged the same amount, 34% in the fall and in the spring. That was kind of disappointing data to have found, so I have thought about some ways that I could have worked on that. I also decided to look at their overall performance growth in MAP in the informational text area. And what this was MAP gives an area that they put students in. They could be in the low, low average, average, high average, or high. And based on that MAP grouping, I had students that decreased in my low area from 42% to 21%. That was from the fall to the spring. And I also had students that increased in my area of average from 17% to 33%. And then I had an increase from 8% to 13% of students who were actually in the high and high average area. So I did see improvement and growth through my students' areas on the MAP assessment in informational text. My summary of my MAP assessment data is that my students actually showed major growth in their RIT scores, but they didn't actually show growth in their percentiles as much as what I thought, because my students who were tier 3 and tier 2 actually remained at the same percentile from the fall to the spring. And as I said, the assessment gets harder throughout the year, and I also was able to see that my students' ability to comprehend informational text improved, showing now that 58% of my students were actually on second grade level. That means 14 out of my 24 students were on grade level or higher by the end of the 2015-16 school year. And this was the data analysis of my teacher-created assessment that I made over text features for my students. This data was able to show me that 100% of my students actually show growth throughout the year, which is amazing to me. And I had 96% of my students who actually improved in at least one performance level. And the performance levels have to deal with a rubric that I created. And for example, on student 1, a 4 out of 25 is a novice, meaning they only got 4 questions right. So when I was able to see performance levels move too, I also thought that was very valuable information to include in my research. And 75% of my students actually scored at the proficient level or higher on their post-assessment during the spring 2016 testing time. And some of my students didn't actually show growth because as much as others, because some of my IEP students who struggle with reading were having a really hard time. And then I had one student who was already at the exemplary level, so he didn't really have anywhere else that they could move up. And some continued data analysis were some patterns of growth and reduction that I had on my teacher-created assessment. And I was able to see that my novice scores were reduced from 46% to 0%. So my novice was completely reduced throughout the year. And my emerging scores were reduced from 46% to 4% in the spring, meaning only one student was at the emerging level by the spring testing period. And my developing scores increased in the fall from 4% to 21% in the spring, my proficient levels of my students increased from 0% to 54% in the spring. And I was very proud to see that my students are actually understanding text features. And my exemplary scores even increased from a 4% in the fall to a 21% in the spring. And my students who didn't meet the proficient goal, that was 25% of my students. That averaged out to be 6 of the students in my classroom out of 24. And these students are my special needs students, and I was working on a referral with one of those other students, and then I had a student in this who also had a behavioral issue that may have contributed to their inability to score at the proficient level. So my summary of my teacher-created assessment is that 100% of my students show growth in their ability to understand text features effectively, and 75% of my students mastered second grade text features in their informational text. 25% of my students struggled with writing their responses, reading comprehension, and just understand the questions that were designed for them on the assessment. And I had 17% of my students were below grade level in reading, which made it more difficult for them to complete this second grade assessment. And I also decided to compare my informational text and teacher-created assessment. And based on the data from my MAPS assessment and my teacher-created assessment, I was able to see that students' percentile groupings did not change very much in MAPS, but their overall performance in MAPS decreased from 67% of students below grade level in informational text to 42% in the spring. And my data analysis concludes that I feel like my teacher-created assessment was successful on helping my students improve their comprehension of informational text on their MAPS data. Some other strategies that I could have incorporated to help my teacher-created assessment were more comprehension skills of informational text and more tiered RTI groupings to help my students during small group. And the reflection of my classroom question is, this really allowed me to see data that I didn't know was there when I actually went through and assessed it, and it allowed me to see if my text feature assessment actually correlated with my students' success on their MAPS assessment. And I was able to see their growth throughout the year in text features and also their ability to comprehend informational text. And I was able to focus on things like reteaching specific text feature skills that students may have been struggling with. I was able to see that maybe if I had done more tiered instruction during my small group, it could have helped my students focus more on their informational text comprehension. And it provided me with information to help me guide my classroom instruction. And I think it would be this data is very beneficial to show my fellow second grade teachers, because they also use this assessment in text features to help their students with informational text. And I feel like that this might help them to want to go back and look at their data and see if their assessment was actually effective in correlation to their MAPS assessment data.